Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Executive Hub webinar series. My name is Amanda, and I am the host of the velocityHUB Executive Hub webinar, where we have interactive conversations with executives about strategic and high-level business concepts, as well as the tactical day-to-day actions for getting stuff done and driving organizations of all types. Our goal is to help you see into the minds of impressive strategic thinkers, executive leaders, and successful business owners so that you can learn from their mistakes and emulate their successes. Here's our agenda for today. I'll introduce Chris, and then he and I will talk about common challenges that small businesses face, 6 keys to small business growth and leadership in both large and small organizations. Our goals are for you to understand these common challenges for small businesses, learn the 6 keys to growth, and more specifically, how you can implement them, and learn from leadership lessons in both small and large organizations. So this month, I'm excited to have Chris Licata, CEO of the Tecnica Group USA, on the Executive Hub. The Tecnica Group is a global leader in sportswear design and manufacturing in winter sports, outdoor, and sporting goods industry, housing brands like Tecnica, Nordica, Moonboot, Rollerblade, Blade Runner, and Blizzard. Prior to his role at Tecnica, Chris was the president and CEO of Lakes All Natural Foods and a leader in the organic and natural foods industry, where he led the rapid growth and eventual sale of the company to million-dollar giant ConAgra Foods. In 2014, Chris was named the Small Business Person of the Year by the U.S. Small Business Administration. Prior to Blake's, Chris spent 20 years in the ski, outdoor, and action sports industry as president and vice president of large companies like Dina Starling Look and Salomon. So Chris's background is relevant today because we are talking about small business growth, and Chris certainly took the Blake's business from small to mega. And I'm eager to have this conversation with Chris today. So with that, I'd like to welcome you, Chris, to the Executive Hub.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for joining us. So I just went through a very high-level background on your career and how you got to where you are. So just in your own words, if you could just share with us how you got to where you are now.
Sure. So for as long as I can remember, the mountains have always been really important to me.
Yeah.
I was a kid that in middle school would walk from the school to our local ski shop with my friend Kevin and a couple days a week throughout the winter and just hang out on the sales floor listening to the salesmen talk about the equipment and fit boots, and we'd watch the new clothing come in, and I remember just being fascinated by it. I also remember occasionally watching reps come in and watching the kind of energy and camaraderie that existed within this group of sort of ski industry professionals. And I remember that having a profound impact on me. In fact, I remember going home and saying to my parents, when I grow up, someday I want to be a ski rep, or I want to be in the ski industry. So if you take that idea of being in my early teens, scrolling ahead to when I graduated from college, I graduated, and much to the dismay of my parents, was with my degree coaching high school lacrosse and working in that very same ski shop. But it really confirmed for me my love of the industry, but it also highlighted the fact that it was clear to me that in my professional journey, I needed to be doing something that I was closely and passionately connected to. And so that sort of launched me on my way. I worked in retail for 2 years and had my first opportunity with Salomon at a really unique time where the company had been growing. And without going through the details of my 12 years at Salomon, suffice it to say that I started very young. I think I was 23 when I was originally hired at Salomon. I worked my way from the equivalent of the mailroom from a Salesforce perspective up to managing about 120 million in business. And the most exciting part about my time at Salomon, which I carry with me today, is that it was an explosive period where we were entering lots of different product categories. And so I had a front row seat at either directly managing and leading the introduction into things like footwear or snowboards or snowboard apparel or inline skates or things like this, in addition to our alpine business. And so I learned quite a bit about bringing products to market. So I was there for 12 years. I then had the opportunity to lead my own business for Dina Star Lang and Look, which I did for about 4 years until the company was acquired by Quicksilver, which is the surfwear apparel brand. And at that point, I came to this sort of moment in my life where I started to ask myself, after 20 years in the industry, maybe this is time for something different. And I realized that you get few chances in life to reinvent yourself, and maybe this was one of those times. In the background, my wife and I had twin daughters and was developing a passion that rivaled my passion for the ski and outdoor business, which was food. And I was starting to learn more about the significant roles that food can play in improving people's lives. And we just happened to have a food company in the family. My wife's parents were running a very small but stable frozen food business, and started to ask the question about whether this was sort of divine intervention. This was my opportunity to pursue something that I was becoming really interested in. Yeah. And so at that moment, my wife and I left Vermont. We moved back to New Hampshire. I took over at Blake's and had an amazing run for 10 years. During that time, I was pulled back into the ski industry to help run Tecnica and Blizzard sort of concurrently, which is a whole nother story. But ended up having to just commit myself 100% to Blake's, especially in the later years. After the sale of Blake's, I stayed for a little bit over a year. I had an opportunity to return back to the Tecnica Group, which is an amazing company with those brands that you had mentioned, with an incredible group of people to lead the entire organization. And so I took the decision at that time to leave Blake's, which was bittersweet, but to return back to my native industry, and which is where I am right now.
Okay, so. Perfect. So we're going to be talking about small businesses today, so I know we'll hit a lot on Blake's, and I'd like to go through the history in a few minutes. But before we do, I wanted to hit on a few of the stats around small businesses. The definition of a small business by the U.S. Small Business Administration is a business with less than 500 employees. So you can see here, small business is something that impacts half of the workforce. So we have in the U.S. 28.8 million of U.S. businesses are small businesses, and 56.8 million of U.S. workers are employed by small business. So that means about 48% of all U.S. jobs. And then in New Hampshire specifically, with Blake's being in New Hampshire, about 130,000 of New Hampshire businesses are small businesses. 286,000 of New Hampshire workers are employed by small businesses. So over half of the jobs in New Hampshire are with small businesses. So I know Blake's is located in Concord or just outside of Concord. Yeah. So I'd love to hear just a little bit about the Blake's history, how it got started, and when you got there.
Sure. The history is it's a great story. So Blake's was started in 1939 by, as we refer to her, great-grandma Clara, and it was started as just a family farm. In the mid-40s, great-grandma Clara with her son Roy Blake converted it to a working turkey farm. And so from the mid-40s really to the late 60s, the sole business was as a working turkey farm. At that time in the mid-60s, my father-in-law, Charlie Blake, had graduated from the University of New Hampshire, the School of Agriculture, and essentially inherited the farm, was given the farm, but also was given with it a host of challenges and just the realities of running a small business. Price of grain had increased. There was an issue with several of the flocks that he was getting in. A virus that was affecting how they were growing, and he found himself in the classic Yankee dilemma of how do I make ends meet. And so he did what any resourceful New Englander would do. He took great-grandma Clara's turkey pot pie recipe and some turkey meat that he had processed. He made a dozen pies according to her recipe, froze them, went down to the corner of Main Street in Concord and started selling these pies out of his van. And the short version is that took us from let's say the early 70s through the mid-2000s, where the business was sort of a local and regional frozen business selling really 4 items to about 300 stores. And so that was, 2005, 2006.
Mm-hmm.
I came to the business in 2006 following, as I was mentioning, following the me leaving Dina Star Lang and Look.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, tried to communicate a vision with my in-laws, with my family, to grow the business where I thought it could go based on the things that I had been learning and felt that we could do with the business. And that so really was from 2006 through the eventual sale of the business, the growth that I know that we'll talk about, and the eventual sale to Conagra Foods in the spring of 2015.
Okay, great. So I know along the way, I'm sure there were a number of different challenges that came up and probably relevant for other small business owners and people that work in small business. So when you think about some of those challenges, what were some of the key things you did to overcome small business challenges, and what would you recommend for others?
Well, this is a great starting point. So, this idea around aligning a vision, I had come from a completely different industry and admittedly knew nothing about food. The one thing I came to realize really quickly is that, the food business is a tough predatory business, and in order to get off on the right foot, I needed to make sure that I was aligned with my in-laws, specifically my family, on the direction. The idea of clarifying a brand promise is something I know we're going to talk about, but it was essentially the idea of trying to find a way to capture all the things that made the brand so unique and find a way to communicate that out to a broader audience. Building and managing a team is always some of the most exciting parts of running a business. It can also be the most challenging, and so staffing up for a period of anticipated growth was something that was nuanced, but was really exciting. The idea around financing growth, we'll talk much more about this, but perhaps the most interesting, for sure, can be the most challenging component of managing and financing a business that's growing. It's even more so today because of the banking regulations. It's a little bit harder to borrow money than it used to be, but figuring out the strategy for financing the growth, competing with big businesses, as I said. The food business is a full contact sport, and the big companies play rough. And so we had to eventually develop a strategy that would allow us to compete. And while we're doing all these things, and of course working, sometimes longer hours, and trying to deal with all the stresses and the things that I just mentioned, trying to find a way to maintain some degree of balance in my life. So I didn't lose my mind, and my family didn't want to throw me out of the house. So. Okay.
Well, if we can, I'd like to step through each of these, starting with aligning a vision. So when small business owners, people in small businesses think about aligning a vision, what are some of the things you recommend that they do based on your experience, and then other things you've seen?
Yeah, I think having a clear vision really is step one, regardless of the size of the business. If you're running a business or taking over a business and the vision isn't clear or it's somehow obstructed, I think that's really got to be step one. On the positive side, it's a great opportunity to include your team in sort of clarifying what that vision is. If you're going to a company, whether it's to run it or to work at it, I think it's important that you do your own sort of diligence to make sure that you're aligning with the vision that might exist at the company. And similarly, it's making sure that you align with the people and the values, the things that are important. A lot of us spend more than half of our waking lives at work, and so having that alignment with other people and other values, I think, is important.
Sure.
As I said, for me, making sure that there's an alignment with some of my passions is super important. It doesn't necessarily just need to be an existing passion. It could also be something that you might be interested in. That's great. And ultimately, when you're sort of checking your vision and you're making sure that you're trying to align a vision, sometimes if it just doesn't feel right, it's probably not, and it's good to listen to that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I've heard you say before too is the vision is not just the business vision, but also aligning your personal vision. Because being in a small organization, if you're not moving towards something you're passionate about or you're aligned with, it can be much more challenging in those long hours to keep moving forward. So I think that's really valuable. Thank you.
Sure.
So a few years ago now, I was lucky enough to visit Blake's, and one of the things we talked about quite a bit was the Blake's brand. And if you could, I'd just love to hear how you describe that brand now. I think it might be helpful for other people.
Sure. Well, the one thing I would say without going into too much detail about Blake's is that Blake's is like so many amazing small businesses in New Hampshire, where there's an amazing story, there's often a rich history, and there's so much to communicate. And in the cases like Blake's, Blake's didn't have a history of storytelling, but there was an amazing story to tell. So this idea around clarifying a brand is really about trying to identify the things that make your brand, your product, your people, your process, your history, whatever it might be, unique, and finding all the elements of bringing those to life. Because at the end of the day, the way that I think about brands is brands are really about how a person feels. In my house, for example, I have 14-year-old twin daughters, and an active wife, and you say the brand Lululemon in my house, it means something. It means something to them. They feel a certain way about it, and
so
and you can probably attest. It's not just the clothes or the material; it's the experience of going into the stores. It's probably the experience of bringing your lunch to work in the bag. I mean, it's the whole thing, but it evokes a certain emotion. There's a lot of other very obvious brands that do the same, whether it's Apple or Audi or things like that. And that's what we tried to do with Blake's. We tried to make sure that we were finding ways to communicate the values of Blake's, the fact that we were a family-run business. We cared deeply about the food. We respected the ingredients. We wanted to become trusted. If anything, we wanted to become trusted for a busy mom, an active senior, a busy millennial that's sort of running from work to gym, whatever it was. We wanted to find a way to communicate transparency with who we were and invoke that trust. So one of the things that we did when I got there, because it was a small business, when I got there was no website, there was no phone system, there was no office, there was no visual expression of the brand. But we had this rich story to tell. So the first thing that we did is we embarked on a complete brand identity project where we literally created the brand in a way that wasn't changing a single thing about Blake's. It was clarifying that which made us special. And we paid particular attention to everything, the colors that we used, the typography, the packaging, the imagery, the photographic style, and perhaps most importantly, the tone of voice that we used, because we always wanted to make sure that we were communicating verbally as well as visually in a way that was consistent with the values that we had, which were grounded in trust and respect and integrity and things like this. And so that's really the first thing that we did about it. We also tried to adjust sort of how we went to market, the ways that we wanted to communicate, whether it was through our social channels, through our website, through some PR efforts, through events that we would hold, through how we would look at trade shows. And we really wanted to make sure that every opportunity we were being hypersensitive to communicating a consistent sort of presence. It also had to do, you've got, talking about sales strategy, it was also important that we lived in a retail environment in a place that also reinforced and clarified the brand that we wanted to be. We'll get into this later, but we existed for a long time in just the natural channel because we felt like that was the best retail environment to truly express who we were and the people that we wanted to be talking with.
And that resulted in, I think, this brand book. So this was something that you gave me when I visited, and I think people could see, if they were able to look at it, that it's got all the colors and the imagery. Like if I were looking at this, I would say family. I think the big message was homegrown, and then resulted in something that was tangible, and you could spread out the messages from here. So that was a nice end result there. So you did mention clarifying a brand is very different than changing a brand, and more often than not, for small businesses, they have some sort of history and some sort of story to tell, and it's not necessarily about taking the company and changing it completely and rebranding necessarily, but more often than not, businesses just need to clarify what they are.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there are certainly occasions where a brand, let's say brand redo might be in order, but most of the companies that I've come in contact with have such a unique and passionate story behind them. And so it's really just identifying those things, again, that make you unique, particularly if you're wading into the waters of competing against big businesses. Oftentimes that unique story that big companies just cannot recreate are a competitive advantage. The things that we often thought of as weaknesses, the fact that we own our own production and we made everything by hand, there's a downside to that, which is it costs a little bit more to make. But the upside is that's how people want, at least in our experience, that's what people want from their food. And so anyways, I think usually what I've found is that it really is just about identifying those things that make you unique and finding ways to express those verbally, visually, through the events that you do at really every touch point that you can create with a consumer or a retailer. So.
Well, taking this one step further, I know you have this concept you call simplify, clarify, amplify. So this is kind of the process of clarifying a brand. I know you've done it in several companies that you've worked in. So can you just explain this to us and then how someone else could apply it?
Sure, yeah. This is around clarifying a brand, but it's also kind of a fundamental principle that we use at the Tecnica Group. This is part of our guiding principles that we have at the company. And this idea around the need to simplify is really just simply about removing complexity. There's a well-known sort of retired blue chip CEO that has a great expression, and his expression is complexity has nothing to do with intelligence, simplicity does. And the thing that I love about simplicity, and we talk about this all the time at work, is that simplicity is not confined to the C-suite. It's not confined to the senior leadership team. It can be applied to really every corner of the building, every department, every division, really every employee. And when we talk about simplicity, it's sort of a daily challenge. What can we simplify? If it's our policies, or if it's our programs, if it's our sales conditions, if it's our payment terms, even if it's something like our performance review process, is there an opportunity to simplify? As it relates to a brand, I think providing a consistent and simple message is absolutely essential. We talk about clarity. Clarity is essential to being efficient, especially in a small business. So from sort of a running a business standpoint, setting clear priorities, the need to clarify our priorities, I think is essential. I say all the time at work, there's no such thing as a list of 10 priorities, and I think it's really true, because that will only lead to, 7 or 8 of them being not accomplished or not accomplished to the extent that you'd like. So I think it's little things about setting clear priorities. It's also, from a brand standpoint, it's about clear communication, clarifying your communication, speaking to in a voice that's clear and consistent, because if we're not clear and consistent through those touch points that we spoke about, people will either not understand what we're trying to deliver, they'll misunderstand, but in either case, they're going to be in a situation that we don't want, which is left up to their own devices to make their own conclusions about our brand or our company or our vision or our values. And the last thing that we talk about is this need to amplify. We say at work all the time that it's not enough just to be loud. You've got to be clear. And the analogy that I often make is with regard to music. I mean, you can turn the music all the way up and it is certainly loud, but it's not clear, which means that you don't have the opportunity to listen to the words or appreciate the musicianship in it. So this idea of being loud is amplifying is about eliminating the distortion, being loud but being clear. From our perspective, truly being able to amplify our message is about identifying a short list of vehicles or mechanisms to communicate our brand and investing disproportionately against those, versus identifying 10 or 12 different ways that might work to communicate your brand and distorting the impact and potentially confusing the message. So it's about disproportionately investing against those few that you've determined to be the most effective. And that's what we speak about. When we talk about amplify, that's sort of what we refer to.
Okay. So a couple of questions I have for you on that. First is, you talk about clear vision here. So I think maybe more of a comment is that I've just seen in organizations where if the vision has, it's a full paragraph, then it's something that one isn't simple for others to understand, but even the team itself. And I think there's definitely something to be said for having a vision that's something that's memorable and repeatable. The next question I do have for you, though, is for small businesses, would you recommend even just a simple brand guideline that they put together that distribute amongst their team, or some sort of brand standards?
Well, for sure, brand standards, I would say, is more of sort of a mechanical treatment of the visual identity, and
Sure.
Absolutely, that's something that sounds big and lofty, but agreeing on typography, photographic style, those little basic things are sort of foundational to a brand. But in terms of aligning around the brand principles and the things that the brand stands for, I think is absolutely essential. Yeah. We've led in the different organizations I've worked in, we've led formal, moderated, multi-day brand camps is what we call them, which is an opportunity to get the key stakeholders together to go through a moderated process of identifying and really digging deep on the things that are most important to the company. And the value of that is it really informs what your future strategy is. It makes it clear what you should be focusing on, how you should be speaking, the things that are important. So absolutely. And the outtake of that might someday, eventually be something like a brand book like this. But it also creates internal alignment, internal harmony. If everybody knows, even if it's assigning 3 or 4 words that best capture. When Dina Starling and Look was acquired by Quicksilver, one of the brands within the Quicksilver portfolio was Roxy. And one of the things that stayed with me was essentially a constitution for the Roxy brand. I'm sure by now it's long expired, but they assigned 6 words to the Roxy brand. And every employee that worked for Roxy had to pass every thought, every product, every marketing message through this filter. And it was, the 6 words were daring and confident, naturally beautiful, fun and alive. And if you take those 6 words and you can communicate that clearly to all those that work for you, and that becomes the internal filter, it's amazing how much alignment that can create and how much consistency and all the things that we spoke about, how much it can create.
That's a great example. I like that a lot. Okay, so the next one, this is a big one, I know, and we've talked about it in the past, financing growth. So when we've talked about Blake's, this was something that helped you be successful, was your strategy around financing growth. So what were some of those strategies, and how would you recommend others move forward with that?
Financing is a really, it's so critically important. It's honestly, in my experience, it was the most challenging part, just because of the different options and the different decisions that need to be made. I think it's one of the hardest parts about running a business. And each situation and each solution, I think, is quite different. And for those of us that are small business owners and they're also deeply personal because it affects your personal income. It affects those that are sort of potentially buying a right to have an opinion about the way that you do things. Yeah. There's certainly no shortage of lending options. It's easy to say that there's a lot of money that's sort of on the sidelines waiting to be activated. And what's on the slide right now are certainly the obvious examples of the ways that you can finance the growth. Our financing journey, much like everything that I'm talking about today, is not necessarily the right way to do it. It just happened to be the way that we did it, and fortunately it was successful. But I can talk you through a little bit of the financing journey for Blake's, because I think it might have some parallels with a lot of other small businesses. So starting in 2006, we created this vision and we started deploying against a strategy that I'll talk about in just a little bit. And the result was that we were growing. I think our average growth over the course of those 9 or 10 years was 40%. So we were growing. Keep in mind that in the early days, it was 40% on a relatively small number, but the numbers got more meaningful as the time went on. But so we were growing our business, which meant that we needed to continue to be investing in things like raw materials and people and the overhead increases and all those things that come with a growing business, that like the problems that you want to have. But at the same time, when you're growing, or at least when we were growing in those earlier days, we were generating losses. We couldn't make enough money to keep up with the investments that we needed to make. So not only were we in a situation where we needed to invest in our growth, we needed to finance our losses as well. And that increases the burn rate on your cash even faster. And so we, over the course of the 9 years, had to find different solutions. It started with sort of self-funding. We invested some of our own money. The goal of a family business for us was to try and keep as much of the ownership of the company as we could. So we invested our own money to start. That got us to a certain point. The growth continued, the burn rate continued, and there was a point in maybe 2007 or so that we reached out to just a few people that were very close to our family for a very small round of investment, which got us to the next point. And this is when, so 2 years in, we were really starting to validate this idea that there was, our vision, our strategy was on track. And with every bit of evidence to suggest that we were going in the right direction, our enthusiasm grew, but it was harder to pursue the direction because of the need for cash. So there came a point where there had been a private equity group that had reached out to us that expressed interest in investing in us. So we had a few meetings with them. This is shortly after the meltdown of the economy in the third and fourth quarter of 2008. But they wanted to invest $1.4 million in our business at a point in time where we so desperately could have used the money just, again, to continue to build on the direction we had been going. And we had a few meetings with them, and at the final meeting they said, this is what we want to do. And I remember leaving the meeting and sitting with our CFO and him saying, "What do you think?" And I remember saying, "Gosh, we need this money so bad. We could really take it to the next level if we had it." But and they were very nice people, but I just can't imagine sitting at the table with them and having to, we are so crystal clear on our vision. There's never been more alignment. We know what we need to do. It can't just be about the money. And we ended up walking away from that. I regretted it for the ensuing weeks, but we found a way to get through it. And one of the ways that we got through it is what I would describe as our bridge period of financing, going from a period where we were not bankable to being bankable. And we identified a few different amazing entities in New Hampshire that are available to any small business. The first that we started working with was a risk-tolerant capital arm of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund called Vested for Growth. Vested for Growth is sort of a bridge between when you or your family are putting in money and traditional financing when you're not yet bankable, but you've got a viable business. They take a little bit more risk, but they're amazing people to work with, and we developed a relationship and some custom lending facilities that allowed us to bridge the gap between being rapidly growing but not yet bankable to rapidly growing and bankable. So their goal is, we don't want you to use us for very long because we want you to get over the hump. So Vested for Growth is a great resource. They're based in Concord, New Hampshire. That's available to anybody. I can't speak highly enough about them. And also there's a company, there's an entity in Concord called the Capital Region Development Corp, CRDC. And there's a woman there named Liz Sweeney who's just amazing and sort of delivers on the same promise of Vested for Growth. So we worked with them during that bridge period to finance some upgrades and improvements to our facility. So there are these nooks and crannies in the lending world that really are appropriate for companies like Blake's that were growing quickly, that had a sound business plan, but just didn't bridge up to being bankable. Sure. We finally got to the point where we were convincingly profitable, and we were bankable, and we were able to establish a great relationship with a local bank, which was Merrimack County Savings Bank, and a great relationship with their senior team, which led to one of the most beneficial financing relationships that we had, especially in the last few years, and that was the relationship that we had with the SBA. it's never been more fashionable to make fun of the government than it is right now. But I can tell you that the work that the SBA is doing in New Hampshire, the work that Greta Johansson, who leads the SBA in New Hampshire, is doing, it was transformative in the development of Blake's from, really getting to the next level where we became this meaningful acquisition target. Sure. There's one story that I think is instructive to tell about our financing journey. We went to Merrimack County in 2008, I think, when we were still maybe 2 years away from being bankable, and we reached out to them and we said, this is our business plan. This is what we want to do. We'd like to borrow some money from you. And we spent a few months getting to know them and them getting to know us. And this banker, who was wonderful, came back to us and he said, I believe in everything you're doing. I believe in you and your team, but you're just not quite ready. But keep us in mind because there's going to come a day and we're going to have this conversation again. So for the next 2 or 2.5 years, even though there was no expectation of it, we sent him our financials twice a year so they could see how we were doing, even though we didn't ask them for dime one. We didn't fill out another application. We just wanted to keep them abreast and keep them close to us. And sure enough, 2.5 or so years later, we were in a position. They already had a running start at our business. They understood the success rate. They understood the risks. They understood the people. And it was just a great way to sort of continue our relationship with them.
Sure. Oh, that's great. Just talking about the vision of saying, hey, we might not be ready yet, but someday we are, and let's choose a little earlier than we might be ready for. So one thing that I find really fascinating is talking about your exit when you left Blake's and the sale of Blake's. So can you just talk to us just a little bit about the journey of exiting?
Sure. In the world of food, and I suspect any CPG category, data is king. And the results that Blake's were posting we were becoming conspicuous to within the industry. Blake's was the fastest growing brand in the natural channel. We were starting to erode the business of some of the big strategics that had big brands, and so we became an acquisition target over the last few years of running the business. And so we started to listen to that for a host of family reasons and for the benefit of our employees and our community. We felt like it was a good time to start to consider that. So we identified a small boutique investment banking firm called Whipstitch Capital that became friends of mine over the years that came to know the Blake's business. I came to trust them and watched their work, and so we identified a process that took about 10 months, where we stepped through a formal process of putting together the essential information and being selective with those that we spoke with, and fortunately there was quite a bit of interest, and through the relationship we had with our banker, our investment banker, we came to a point where we felt like it was the right thing for the business, the community, the family, everybody involved, that Conagra was the best decision. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. So speaking of the people, I know that when you went into Blake's, you had to think about who you want to bring on to your team, and I think you said you had about 10 people when you started. 12 when you started. So when you were building the team, what were some of the things you did to bring on new people, and what would you recommend for others who are expanding?
So the team was small. We didn't have the luxury of bringing on a lot more people. And one thing that I say often is we don't always need more people. We just need amazing people. And it's one of the things both at Blake's and also at Tecnica Group. I've been blessed that we had an amazing team at Blake's, a small team, which I'll speak about in a minute, and the same at Tecnica Group. And it's also relative to the size of the company. It's not a large team either, but it's an incredible group of people. We ran the business at Blake's from an office and a management perspective with 3 people up until about 18 months before we sold the business. So this idea of quality over quantity, the first hire that I made was the CFO that I worked with when I was running Dinostar Lang & Look, he was an incredibly smart guy who believed in the vision that we had for Blake's, so much so that he was willing to move down to Concord and go on this journey with me. And he and I, with my mother-in-law, were the three that essentially ran the business, in addition to the people that ran the facility. But in terms of the strategic direction of the company, we ran it with the same amount, almost the same amount of people the day I started to the day that we sold, and that's a testament to the strength of the team. So for me, it's always more about who the people are and how much they can stretch and are willing to do. And it kind of leads to this next thing about the things that we always found important. When in a small business, it's so critical that you have people that know that, as we used to say at Blake's, a job description is nothing more than a starting point. Because at Blake's, for example, and I expect that other small business folks can relate to this, is we used to always say that 80% of the things that would happen over the course of the day, we would have no idea what were going to happen when we walked through the door. You'd walk in, and for us, something at the facility would be broken, or there was an issue or a unique opportunity that we needed to drop everything for. And it was sort of life through a series of heroic efforts, or success through a series of heroic efforts. And that required having a team around you that was willing to do whatever it took. We eventually added a marketing person, for example, that shared that in spades, and it helped with really the next thing, which is, for us in a small business, culture is everything. Trust is everything. And so in our experience, in my experience, finding somebody that's a cultural fit trumps an existing skill set, as long as there was the cultural fit and the capacity to grow into a job. So
yeah. One of the analogies I think you used one time was, if you have 15 people around, do you know what I'm talking about? If you want to,
I think one of our last conversations, I think what I was saying is, if you're standing in the circle of 15 people surrounding you and you fall in either direction, you're going to have a lot of people giving you support. So it's not taxing on any one person. Everybody's role is important, but it's not super important because there's somebody standing right next to you. But if you're standing in the middle of three people, the people around you become incredibly important. Yeah. They have to lift a little bit more. They have to move a little bit faster. They have to drop everything that they're doing to make sure that you don't hit the floor. And so that's kind of the analogy that we use with small business.
Yeah, and that's how you come back to finding amazing people.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the big hurdles I think you had to overcome was in the food industry, competing with the big businesses. So how did you compete? What did you do in order to get into some of those big stores?
Well, I think in any industry and in any company any size, the product's got to be amazing. I mean, this idea of all the lipstick in the world on a product that just isn't good or as good as the competition, it's not going to matter. Eventually, it won't work out. Consumers are smart, and the market's competitive. So from my perspective, competing with big business, first of all, you've got to have a unique, quality promise that you're communicating on. We talked about this before, but one of the biggest advantages that I see for small businesses competing against big businesses is the unique nature of your story. I mean, I talked about, in the case of Blake's, we were a very small business competing against, the ConAgros of the world, multi-billion-dollar businesses that had so much money to spend in advertising and communication, product development, all those things. So it was just finding a way to clarify this message and amplify our message about why we are unique. Consumers are smart, like I said, and they also, I believe, want to know where in the case of food, they want to know where their food comes from. And one thing that we focused on was making clear that nobody else could do that which we could do. Do they have a made from scratch promise? Do they believe in the same things? Does their family, believe in running a business this way? And so it was really identifying the things that made us unique and trying to find every possible way to communicate that with the limited means that we had. This next idea about a target market and a disciplined approach, we applied an extremely disciplined approach because we just quite simply didn't have the resources to be too shotgun. And what I mean by that is when I got to Blake's, I clearly said that our singular focus until we're convinced otherwise is to build a halo for our brand within the natural channel. So in the world of food, there's the natural channel, and then there's grocery, the supermarkets, there's club stores, there's mass stores like Target or Walmart, and then there's other things like food service and so forth. And we said we are going to forget about all of those other things, and all we want to do is we want to establish Blake's as a brand that has a reason for being in the natural channel with all the label readers, the people that could appreciate the quality, that are willing to pay a little bit more. And that allowed us to be really specific with our spend, and it allowed us to compete more effectively. Most importantly, how it related to competing with big business is it allowed us to rise to the leaderboard in one particular segment, and it essentially proved the thesis that people were willing to pay a little bit more for products made the way that we were making them, with a story behind a brand like we had. It's sort of this focus then migrate approach that we applied. And once other bigger stores in grocery and mass and club saw that we were successful statistically, that's how we were able to then compete with big businesses in that bigger marketplace.
So when you got there in 2006, how many retail stores were you in, and then when you left?
So in 2006, we had 4 items. We were selling about 300 stores in 5 of the 6 New England states, and we employed 12 people. And when we in 2015, at the time we exited, we had 65 employees. We were in 11,000 stores and in all 50 states. So
yeah, just to see the growth, that's fun.
That's
so along the way, you had to make sure that you maintained balance, because I'm sure as a team of 3, and at one point maybe 4, you had a lot of different things that were coming at you. You had a lot of responsibilities, and you probably could have worked 24 hours a day with the amount that you had to do. So what were some things that you did to make sure that you maintained balance?
One of the things is something that a friend and a guy that I consider a mentor in many ways, who happens to be your boss and also your friend, spoke so eloquently about in the last webinar, which is this idea of being committed to this setting aside time for strategic thinking. And that's something that I think is important. Brendan did a very good job of identifying. I think he said that you needed to be most effective, it was something on the order of 10% of your work time dedicated to out of the office, time to just think. And I've never quantified what mine is, and I think it's like something like 167 hours a year. But he did a great job of stressing the importance of it, and that's making time for strategic thinking is something that I've tried to do. That's where my best ideas usually come. It doesn't come when you're in the heat of it, or driving to and from work, or driving to a lacrosse game or something else. So, so trying to find time for the strategic thinking is certainly key. But I've gotten better as I've gotten older of learning to sometimes be a little bit selfish with my time. It might be the fact that I grew up professionally in a really fun industry, which is ski and outdoor industry. So much a part of our natural work life has to do with skiing or doing things outside. And so I've done a better job as I've gotten older of making sure that I do take the time to, if there's 6 inches of snow, that, there's an internal 6-inch rule. If there's 6 inches of snow, I will try to push everything off at work for a half a day and go skiing. If there's a chest high day for surfing, I'm probably going to go to the ocean, or at least find a way to do that. And also little things like tap back into a passion of mine. I've been coaching, as you know, for a long time. And, coaching is a great way to balance my love for lacrosse is with being able to interact with young kids and hopefully have a positive impact on them. But I've also realized that I'm easier to be around. My family will tell you this, and the people at work will tell you that I'm much more fun to be around if I've come to work after being in the water or coming off the mountain. So,
and then I think that speaks to just people finding their own passions and implementing that or integrating them into their work lives to maintain that balance. So, one thing I did want to hit on is that Blake's is a family business. We actually come across a lot of businesses that are second, third, or even fourth generation businesses, and we've all heard horror stories of family businesses, but yours seem to click and work really well. So for those who are in family businesses, what are some things that you think helped Blake be successful that other small businesses could apply in a family situation?
We were so lucky that we started as a functional family. My wife and I are extremely close with her folks, and honestly, it was a concern that would me coming into the business, would that have an effect on the family dynamic? Mm-hmm. And so we did talk about it. I think it's this idea, first of all, about identifying what the family dynamic is, and identifying the kind of relationship you have, and being honest about it. I mean, especially since you're going to be seeing these people every day. For us, it was a little bit easier because the family dynamic was quite natural. When you get into these other things, it required a little bit more work. But this idea of establishing a way to communicate amongst the family members that you're going to be working with, just because you're related doesn't necessarily mean you know the best way to communicate with each other, particularly when you add the stresses of a work situation. So agreeing on how you're going to communicate, when you're going to communicate, importantly, when you're not going to communicate, is critically important. One thing that we talked about, and I've seen it positively and negatively affect family businesses, is this idea of clarifying the roles. In a family business, sort of implied is that everybody has the best interests of the company in hand and everybody's got strong opinions. But there comes a point where decision rights need to take over, and being decisive with where those decision rights lie is critical. I mean, it will avoid a lot of the sort of the unfortunate resentment that could come if those roles are not clarified. It eliminates the confusion and the infighting. And this last thing about separating family time, we had an expression that we used often at Blake's, and that was that our kitchen table is also our coffee table. And that applied most of the time, but there were certain times where that we agreed that we weren't going to talk about work. And as the years went on, we sort of got to know each other's rhythm and knew when it would be appropriate. I think the holidays are an interesting time because you've got a lot of family together, and one thing that unites a family business is the business, and so the natural gravity pulls you towards talking about the business. But one of the things that we discovered, and it was quite natural, is we ended up spending most of the holidays without talking at all about the business. So, yeah.
That's good.
So I think
have that dedicated time for sure.
Yeah, and I think it comes with just establishing a rhythm with your family. Yeah. So.
All right. Well, good. So one other thing I did want to hit on today was that you had the opportunity to lead in large organizations and then small organizations with being at Blake's. So would you say there are differences in how you approach leadership, or maybe some similarities too?
Well, obviously leadership is critical no matter what. I think that I think they reveal themselves maybe a little bit differently in smaller organizations versus larger. In my experience at Blake's, leadership was not just sort of determining a vision and communicating the vision. It was leadership by doing. In a small business, like we talked about, everybody does everything. And it could be a quiet way of showing leadership to your team that you're willing to, I mean this most literally, take the garbage out or clean the bathroom or do whatever it is. I mean, there's subtle cues. But I think it's this idea about leading by example. Yeah. Bigger companies might not have those same opportunities, but I think there are opportunities with bigger companies to not just set goals, but to set vision. Goals are the things that are obviously defined, but vision is a sort of a rallying cry, something that's bigger than a goal to get people aligned with. And I think the trick is to develop a way to communicate, to identify and then communicate that vision that really ties into all the people in a bigger organization. I also think one of the unique differences is, with, at least in my experience, with a small company, I was connected to the people directly. It was a smaller group. It was my own business, our own business. And so the ability to lead was more natural because the interaction points were much higher, because I was interacting with the people on a regular basis, all of the people. In a bigger business, sometimes we get insulated and isolated just to our senior team. And so I think there is still an opportunity to lead all the people beyond just clarifying and communicating a vision. But I think it requires a little bit more work, like getting out of your office and not just communicating with your direct reports and going and talking to people, regardless of the department that they might work in, and not just to give them the corporate vision, but to let them know a little bit more about you, to build that trust, build that sense of culture and community. So I think there are certainly nuances between big and small.
Yeah, I think one thing that I resonate with, that I kind of extract from that, is that when you're in a large organization, you probably do much more leading, and then when you're in a smaller one, you're not just leading but also managing. So you're kind of doing the day-to-day management. And there is a difference there. Just with more hands, you can do more, but in a small organization, you can be surprised by how much you can get done. So a few other questions for you, since we have a few more minutes. So we originally met on a sports field, and we both have a passion for sports, and you were an athlete in college as well. So given that you said food is a full contact sport, how do you think that being an athlete has helped you in your career?
Oh gosh, so many ways. I think it's taught me the value of competition, what it means to work hard. It's taught me that you've got to put in the work or you're not going to survive. It's something that this love for sport has sort of permeated my family as well. We've got a family of athletes, and it's been fun to watch those lessons take hold with our kids. It taught me about trust and camaraderie and teamwork, of course. And one thing that I think it's taught me that I didn't realize until I was no longer an athlete is it taught me this appreciation for leadership. I look back on the people that were the most influential in my career and in my life. One is in a work context, which was a previous boss, but probably the most influential was my college lacrosse coach. And I often tap into the leadership that I didn't necessarily know was having as strong of an effect on me at the time, but I often reflect back on that. So it's taught me the value of that. And as a coach, I think about that all the time. So. Okay.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I agree, especially on the leadership. So probably have time for one more. So I have this quote that you sent to me a long time ago. That's something that you think really resonates with you, and it does with me too. And the quote for everyone here is, there may be people that have more talent than you, but there's no excuse for someone to work harder than you do. And I think that's really relevant in a small business, because it's hard work, but it's rewarding work. So talk to me just a little bit about that quote and how it's played out in your life.
Yeah, I think it's it's being comfortable enough to know that I am absolutely not the smartest guy or the most creative, but I always believed in unapologetically doing my best work. And there have been little examples over my career where I sort of tried to live to this idea that it's never enough just to do what's expected of you. You've got to find a way to over-deliver at every opportunity. And so whether it's on an athletic field or whether it's in business, sort of recognizing that there are people that are going to be smarter. But the one thing that has always been within my control and everybody's control is how much preparation you're going to put in, how much time you're going to commit to being the best version of yourself as an athlete or as an employee or as a boss or whatever. So,
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here today.